Good morning and greetings in Jesus' name. It's good to be here, and I would like to continue studying from Colossians 3:12, and we were talked the last time about 2 weeks ago, I think that was, about being clothed in compassion and kindness, and I'd like to continue looking at those attributes there that are in those verses in Colossians 3. I think we'll read again 12 through 14. I think we'll read that at this time. Colossians 3, verses 12 through 14. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against another, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. And above all these things, put on charity, which is the bond of perfectness. So in these verses here, we're looking at the next two items. They kind of seem to be in pairs. They have kindness and bowels of mercies, it says there in the King James, and kindness. And the next two are humbleness of mind and meekness. And those are the two items I'd like to think about this morning as we think about putting on the elect of God, is that idea of humbleness and meekness. And this is one of several places where Paul talks about putting on, as if wearing something, that we're putting on these attributes. And there's a verb that's used to describe this this is also a descriptive word, but it's also a verb. And somebody has said that it's the same word that was used for when a slave or a servant tied on an apron to go about a menial task. And so it has this idea of putting on as not only adorning or putting on clothing, but also as getting ready to do something. And so if you were working in the kitchen, I suppose they would use a work apron, or a blacksmith will also often use a work apron as well for the sparks that might fly off the anvil and things like that. And so it has this idea also of an action word too, that we're putting this on and we're doing these things. And like I mentioned last time, wherever you go in the world, people are identified by the clothes that they wear. Clothing is something that's outward and it's noticeable, and it often distinguishes a people or a culture by what they wear. And so when you see a certain type of dress, you kind of know, well, those people are from this area, or they're from that religion, or this culture, or whatever. It's something that's outward and it's very noticeable. So in the text today, we want to look at what Paul is saying about what God wants his people to be noticed for. There was some things listed before this that we would not want to be noted for. In verses 8 and 9 has a list of negative things like lying or sins, anger, wrath, blasphemy, filthy communication, lying, all those things. Those are the things we don't want to be known for, but these things in verses 12 and 13 are the things that we want to be adorned with as Christians. When I look at my life, or when others observe it, what do they notice? As God's children, Paul says that there's these virtues that we should be noticed for, and so that's what we want to look at this morning, is the virtue of humility and meekness. And one definition of biblical humility is, somebody has said they defined it as a posture of the heart and mind that is characterized by the absence of pride and a commitment to the well-being of others. And I think that's a pretty good definition of what humility is. It's the absence of pride and the commitment to the well-being of others, putting others first, simply put. A humble person recognizes his or her dependence on the Lord and willingly submits to God's way over their own way. And that's another aspect of it, is that aspect of submission to God's way instead of my way, even though that's not the way that we're bent. Humility is simultaneously the hardest and one of the most important Christian attributes or virtues that we are called to master. And I think that's very true. It's something that it's hard to identify, and it's hard to know if we've reached it, because once we think we've reached it, we pretty much know that we're not reaching it, because that's a sign of pride. If you think that I pretty much mastered the art of humility, well, obviously you probably have some things to work on then in seeing yourself as you truly are. When I looked up humility, there was a lot of teaching from saints that lived in monasteries and things like that sounded really, really virtuous and wise and things. But humility, it didn't really appeal to me, I have to admit, their writings, because humility feels like something that's practiced every day in the day-to-day life, not something that you practice in a monastery and write about and say all kinds of nice things about. It's about submitting to others and not needing to have the last word. And that's something that is very, very practical every day in every part of our life. Humility is something that affects how we act and what we do. And I had to think about in the last couple weeks, the last 2 weeks, there have been 2 accidents in front of our office there at Landis Technologies where people do not want to yield to each other. The 322 begins to merge back, and there's a merge point there where it goes back to one lane. And when people are coming down there, it's down a hill too, and I think people are picking up speed, and nobody wants to give up. And we've actually, I don't know if we had too many accidents that we've seen before, but in the last 2 weeks, 2 people actually hit each other and spun the cars around. Nobody was hurt in either case that I know of. But again, it was because 2 people got in that lane and neither one of them was going to give up, and they ended up having an accident. But every day, almost daily, there's horn blowing and finger waving and gesturing and all kinds of stuff that goes on there because people are determined that they're not going to be the one that yields. I'm not going to be the one that gives up my right of way, and if I'm in the other lane, I'm not going to let the other guy pass me. And we're probably all, I'm prone to that, and you're probably all prone to that if you drive, to that same feeling of not wanting to yield, even though sometimes we have the yield sign, but we still don't want to do it. It's very true in all of life, and it's very true that I want to stay in my lane, and I don't want to be slowed down or have to back off. I don't want to give up my rights to let somebody else go in front of me. I want to have my position right where I want it to be, and that's a very common sinful temptation is that we don't want to yield. And humility is the answer to that problem. Humility is the ability, the God-given ability to yield to other people in the right way that God wants us to yield to them. When I can remove myself from the picture and having my way and defending my rights, then I will be able to yield to others. And I think then we're beginning to learn what humility really means as it's lived out in everyday life, not just in a monastery or as some ideal. So there's a lot that we could say about humility, but I think the reason humility is difficult for us is because it just runs completely counterculture or counter to our sin nature, and we often want our happiness over other people's happiness. But if you turn to Philippians 2:3-4, we can look at a few more verses on this subject. There's a lot of verses we could turn to on the subject of humility, but Philippians 2:3-4 also has these words. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Very well-known verse, but very, very true, that often who we really want to be looking out for is ourselves, not the esteeming of other people, but what we want to be looking at is what appeals to us and what appeals to our nature and what we want. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. And so to wear humility, this idea of putting it on like a piece of clothing that we wouldn't leave home without. Every morning we get dressed and we go out when we're going in public. It's the same way, although I think humility is not something that you just put on in the morning. It's a 24-hour-a-day thing as well. That's where the analogy falls a little bit short. But Jesus has to first transform us and give us a heart that is both God-focused and other-focused for that to happen. It doesn't just happen because we try harder or that we can somehow do this without having Christ in our life. People can have an appearance of humility without Christ, but I think when things really come down to the wire, that humility will give way under pressure. So we need the Spirit's help to be thinking of others as more significant or more worthwhile or esteeming them better than we esteem ourselves. That's not an easy thing to do. And so humility is a very Christian attribute. I think other religions talk about it as well, but it's something that's very, very key to what it means to be a Christian and to live it out in everyday life. We can't get there on our own. If we think we can, we don't know much about humility if we think we can do it without God and Jesus and the Spirit helping us. Humility is about yielding, but it is not weakness either. And so that's where this idea of meekness comes through. And meekness is not weakness, even though that's kind of what the world often thinks, is that if somebody's meek, they're somebody that just acquiesces to anything and doesn't have a backbone, and somebody that can be easily run over is a meek person. But the idea of meekness, is the definition of it, is really gentle strength, or strength with power, or strength with gentleness. So it's this idea of a reluctance to assert oneself or one position. Even though you have the position and you have the authority, you don't use that authority wrongly as a way to force people into things they don't want to do, or use it to assert yourself and who you are. Meekness is somebody that has the authority but uses it in a humble way. And so meekness is the posture or appearance of humility, what it looks like when it's practiced especially for people that are in authority positions. And Jesus, in Matthew 11:29, Jesus talks about himself. He says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and lowly," or gentle and lowly in heart, "and you will find rest for your souls." And in that verse, Jesus says, personally, he's talking about himself and says, "This is who I am. I'm somebody that is meek and lowly." Or gentle is another way to talk about that. And so both of those words, lowly and meek, imply non-resistance, somebody who doesn't fight back, who doesn't demand their rights, who doesn't try to be the one that wins the fight, that's willing to give up in cases where it's not necessary to be fighting over something. It suggests somebody who's humble, yielding, and long-suffering, in contrast to an assertive, aggressive, arrogant, obstinate, and haughty person. And all those attributes are the antonyms to what humility and meekness are. Assertive, aggressive, arrogant, obstinate, and haughty. And we know that we can be tempted to be like that, and we've probably dealt with a lot of people who are like that, and it's not nice dealing with people who have that kind of an attitude versus somebody who is humble. It's just a completely different picture when you're dealing with those two types of personalities. So how do we put on humility? Well, I think the first step of putting on humility is that we have to recognize that it's necessary, first of all, and that we have a need for it. If we see no need for being humble, then we're in a pretty bad spot. But we need to be able to see that need and then ask God for help in it, because we know that humility does please the Lord. It's what he wants from us. And we can trust that he wants us to be wearing this type of clothing like it talks about there in Colossians. And that's how he wants to see his children dressed, in this adornment of humility and meekness. And we also grow in humility by, like we do with everything, by studying the Word and meditating on it, and especially thinking about passages. If we're thinking about humility, there's many passages we can turn to in the Bible that teach us what it looks like and gives us examples of people that lived with humility too. We have Moses, we have, most of all, we have Jesus, and we have many other examples as well that give us an idea what a person that's living in meekness and humility looks like, and how we can model our lives after that. Again, Colossians 3 here is a good place to start. And one of the things that we can do, I think, especially if we have a problem with yielding to other people, with living out humility, if it's something that we especially struggle with, and this can be in any area of temptation, but is especially think about these verses, meditate on them, and memorize them. And then when those things happen, when we're behind the wheel of our car and somebody cuts in front of us, or we get to a merge point and we don't want to be the one that gives up, or we're standing in a long line somewhere waiting on something that we don't think we should be waiting for, all of those things that are triggers to us that make us get impatient and angry and want to assert our rights, or not somebody's imposing on our time. Make a habit to bring those verses up at that time. Just stop and slow down and think about who I am. What are the clothes that I'm supposed to be wearing? What am I supposed to be looking like in this time? And bring those verses to mind. And I think that will be a big help in helping us to become people that are humble and that in the moment learn to react in the way we should as Christians. It's not that those impulses won't still come up to get angry or to just want to tell somebody off because of something they did to us. But once humility takes over, that reaction might happen, but humility pulls it back down and says, you know what, this in the instance of yielding at that merge point, is it really worth having an accident, putting somebody else's life in danger just because I don't want to give up about 5 seconds of road time? And often that's when you think about many of these things, you realize how insignificant they really are when you just step it out of the emotional part of it, whether it's on the road or many, many other things too, waiting in lines, whatever makes us mad. We might lose a little bit of time, but the result, especially of driving and some of the things that can happen there, of having accidents and putting other people's life in danger, is so out of proportion. And just a little bit of humility lets us back off and say, you know what, I don't need to be the one that wins this fight. It's not worth fighting over in the first place. So what are some things that humility is not? Just some things I thought of here, that humility is not just about not being proud. And when you look at 1 Peter 5, those verses there talk about submitting one to another, and it says, for God resisteth the proud and giveth grace to the humble. Humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. And so it talks about the younger submitting yourselves to the elder, and all of you be subject to one another. And so again, that idea of being subject to each other comes through. And humility is about rightfully seeing yourself before God, seeing myself as God sees me, or starting to get that picture. We'll never truly know that here on earth, but as we open ourselves up to God and to His Spirit, we can begin to see a little more who we are in relation to who God is, and that right there will give us a lot of an idea of what humility looks like and why we need to practice it. And pride is what keeps us from seeing ourselves as we truly are. When pride is reigning in our life, it's one of the reasons why God resists the proud. It says he opposes the resist the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. To those who are humble and see themselves as God sees them and realize their weakness and their position in comparison to God, God says, for those people I have grace. But for the proud people who see themselves as pretty good all around, God says he opposes those people. There's a minister, I don't know his name, but John Flavin, this was a quote from him. He said, speaking about a right view of ourselves before God, they that know God will be humble, for they that know themselves cannot be proud. And I think that's true, that once we have an understanding of ourselves, there's no way that we can be proud, that we'll be humble people. But again, that's a hard thing to do, and it takes years, I think, of seeing ourselves as God wants us to see us, and it's a growing in that. And so it's not just about being proud, it's also about seeing ourselves as God sees us. And number two, it's not about self-denigration or false modesty. And so that's sometimes when people talk about humility, they have this idea that it's about, putting yourself down. I think that's kind of a Lancaster County term, but maybe other people say it too, but it kind of has this idea that you really, say how terrible you are and how, you're probably a failure in most ways and all this kind of thing. And children do that a lot, but adults do it too. We like to put a lot of disclaimers on things, and sometimes things that we actually know we're pretty good at, but we put the disclaimer on it so that people can kind of see that actually we're not that bad at it and maybe get a compliment or two out of it. Again, that's probably more something that we did in school, but it still can come across subtly as adults as well. But it's not about self-denigration or false modesty, and false modesty is really just kind of a passive-aggressive way of fishing for compliments. It's not really being humble. It's just this idea that, I want to get other people to notice what I'm doing. A humble person does not feel the need for proclaiming their weakness, and they can do something well without needing credit or acclaim. And so even if they do something well, they don't need to be constantly praised and affirmed for it. They may realize they're good at something and there's nothing wrong with that, but a humble person can be good at something. It doesn't mean that we need to be a failure at things, but doesn't need a lot of recognition or acclaim on their account. And they also don't feel the need for proclaiming their weakness, because that's going to become evident anyway. And so if I get up here and say how proclaim all the weaknesses of my sermon, well, I always figure everybody's going to know that anyway. Whatever the weaknesses were, you're all sitting here listening. I don't need to highlight them. You'll figure out what they are. So there's that temptation, though, is to think that humility is about self-denigration or false modesty, and that's not what it is. It doesn't mean that we're people with a low self-esteem. I think humble people have a confidence and strength that other people that are proud do not have. They often, even though they may be proud, they're often very concerned that their whatever their accomplishments are get noticed, and they're very worried about people, maybe not noticing their accomplishments and things like that. And so that's actually a much weaker position in a way than humility is. Humility also does not mean compromise, and so sometimes we also might get the idea that people that are humble or meek are easier, kind of pushovers. And there's this modern idea of tolerance where, you believe what you believe and I'll believe what I believe, and nobody should try to impose their beliefs on anybody else. And, sometimes that idea kind of comes across as what humility is as well, is that it's just about being nice and agreeable. And so if somebody disagrees with me, well, if I'm humble, then I just, say, well, that's, I'm probably in the wrong or something like that. A humble person can be strong in their convictions, and they do not feel personally threatened by those who do not agree with them. And so even though you're humble, it does not mean that you don't have strong convictions and are willing to stand up for those convictions. I think the difference is that somebody that is humble and meek does not feel personally threatened when people disagree with them. They can take that, and they can also give their side of the argument and say why they believe what they believe, without it turning into a big fight, because now personalities are involved in emotions, and it's becoming a thing of pride rather than just somebody challenging my convictions. And that can be in a lot of other areas as well, where once emotion gets into anger, then it turns into something much bigger than the actual point of what was being argued about. So how do I know if I'm humble? That's often a question that comes up, and how do I know if I'm a humble person? Well, that's a valid question, and it's also a very hard question to ask. Anybody who thinks that they're getting close to the mark again is probably farthest from it, because again, if you think you're humble, that's a sign of pride. But Jesus, again, is our best example of humility and meekness, and where he says there in Matthew 11:29 about being gentle and lowly in heart, that humility was the core of who Jesus was. It wasn't just some side aspect of him, but it was being lowly in heart is who he said he was. That was what he was at a very, very deep level. And that idea of lowly means humble, accessible, and non-defensive. Somebody who is humble and doesn't feel the need to defend themselves all the time over or whatever there's conflict about. The one writer said Jesus was not trigger happy, harsh, or proud. And I think that's very true too, that Jesus, even though sometimes he did get angry, he did cleanse the temple, even that was done with control. It wasn't an out of control rage that Jesus went in there, but there was a sense of righteous anger at what was going on. But even in those cases, he wasn't angry or hateful or proud. He was willing to deal with the situations and then taught afterwards on why he did that. So it wasn't like he went in and threw over all the money changers and drove them out, and then that was the end of it. He actually stopped afterwards and said, "This is why I did what I did," and he taught them there in the temple. And we see also the point where Jesus, his instinct was always to move towards sinners and sufferers, people who were in pain or suffering. Jesus' instinct was always to move towards them, not get away from them. And I think that we sometimes, if we're honest, we sometimes see those situations that look very difficult, people that are deeply in sin, people that are suffering from other things as well, and sometimes we just want to back away from it, go hide somewhere and not let those things mess up our life. But that was not Jesus. His instinct was never that. It was always to move towards those people and not away from them. And so humility was not just some posture that Jesus would occasionally adopt when it worked, but it was always his natural disposition. It was, again, who he was at a very deep level. And humility is not our natural disposition. We all know that. We all have a sin nature. It's not what we naturally do. But we can grow in humility, and we can see that. And sometimes it takes many, many years of work and constant, reading the scriptures and praying to God and to the Spirit to help us grow in that, and learning from our mistakes, failing, but then learning to come back from that and grow from those experiences. But it eventually can become much more our natural disposition, just like it was Jesus' natural disposition. It can be something that becomes, maybe that first flare-up of anger starts, but humility more and more begins to tamp that down, and we begin to act like Jesus instead of like somebody that's proud or acting the opposite of him. So whatever our triggers are, our pet peeves, our criticisms, our reactions to criticism, all those things that still may cause a temptation to react, the humility will temper and control those reactions, and that's moving a little more every day to what Jesus was and how he acted. Again, humility is not something Jesus merely teaches, it is who he is, and I think that's a good way to say that. In the book Gentle and Lowly, I think it's Dale Ortland, he says that Christ's humility is the deepest window into his heart, and who you see who he truly was, and therefore the foundation for how believers relate to him and imitate him. And so again, it's very key as Christians that we imitate Christ in being people that practice humility in everything we do. Humility also made Jesus very approachable. Sinners and children and women that were kind of on the outskirts were drawn to him. He drew them to him when they saw him. They were drawn to him, while the proud hated him. They were repulsed by Jesus. They hated what he stood for and what he did, and they eventually killed him. And the Jewish leaders and the Roman Empire. In that book, Gentle and Lowly, he says that Jesus' humility means that he is not repelled by weakness, sin, or failure. And I think that's the same for us, that when we're humble people, we're not people that look at people that are not making it, that are failing, and we're repulsed by them. Instead, we reach out to them in humility, recognizing that we could be there ourselves. We're no greater person than anybody that's living in sin. It's just that we've been saved, and it's only through Christ that we're where we are. And so Jesus' humility and our humility, when it's practiced like Christ, removes fear and invites trust. People sense that coming from a humble person, and they will be drawn to that kind of a person. And if we're practicing humility, people will be drawn to us as well. And so humility forms us into approachable, welcoming people, the kind of people that stand out as different from people that are proud and who are not living in humility. Putting on humility is not just some, again, one-time act. We get dressed for work every day, but this is different. This is something that is not just one time. It's a continual process, and it's a daily commitment. And so every day we need to pray to have humility and meekness in the situations that we're going to encounter. And slowly but surely, we'll begin to see a growth in this area. We'll find our responses to anger and our defensiveness will slowly yield to humility and meekness instead. And I think that that's when people will begin to notice that something is different. The way that we react, maybe if they know us well, they'll know how we reacted in the past, and they'll begin to see that something is changing in us, that we don't react in those same ways in anger or whatever when those instances happen, those trigger points or whatever they are. We have an Army chaplain that used to work for us, and he still stops in a couple times a month just to visit. And when he comes into the office, there's no doubt who he works for. He has fatigues on, and you take one look at him and you know he works for the U.S. Army. There's no doubt about it. And I had to think about that. He has put on the uniform. He put that on, and now I know, and anybody coming there knows, this guy works for the U.S. military, for the Army specifically. And as we close ourselves with humility, I think there will be no doubt about who we work for, too, in much the same way. Maybe it's not as obvious as fatigues or a military outfit, but when people interact with us, they're going to begin to see that the way we act is as unique and different as somebody that's wearing a uniform. It places us in that perspective. So how do I know if I'm humble? We didn't really answer that question. You may be thinking that, but again, how do I know if I'm humble? You still didn't answer that question. Well, humility is not just this internal virtue or an internal disposition. It's something more than that. It's an action as well. And that's where I think you can begin to look at your life and know whether you're living in humility or whether you're not. Because there's some very, very practical aspects of humility that we can look at and know if we're either failing in those areas or growing in those areas. And it's especially seen in the area of relationships. And so I'd like to look at three actions of humility: communication, teachability, and honoring. And I'd like to think about those actions as we think about how can I know if I'm humble or not. Well, think about how you react in these situations, and you'll begin to get an idea of whether you're humble or not. And again, the idea here is not to make you think that now I've arrived. We all have a lot to grow in this area, no matter what we are or where we are in life. But the first one is humility and communication. How we speak about and listen to others. James 1:19 says, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath." And that's definitely one of the aspects of humility that stands out, is when we're able to let other people speak, when I don't have to have the last word on everything, when I can learn to listen instead of talking over everybody else. Somebody that is constantly talking over other people that's not a sign of humility. And learning to ask questions about other people's experiences and their opinions and letting them share their thoughts instead of constantly needing to share my thoughts and my opinions and what I did or what I believe. Again, letting others speak is one of the key parts of humility and communication. And listening actively, when we pay close attention to what other people are saying, what they're actually saying, and not just be thinking, I know what they're going to say next, so I'm preparing my argument for that, or I want to link this to something I did, and so I'm not really listening to what they're saying. It's just a trigger so I can know how I want to talk about myself, basically. Listening actively means that we actually are focusing on what they're saying and thinking about what it means to them, not just what it means to me. And that's, again, a humility and communication. So letting others speak, listening actively, and avoiding gossip. And again, this could be a whole sermon on itself, but when somebody starts to talk negatively about somebody or a situation or something like that, a humble person doesn't get energy from that. They instead realize the problems, maybe the pain this whole situation is causing, and they just don't really want to have a part in it. They'll stop that conversation rather than continuing in it. And again, there could be a lot more said about that. But, instead of a humble person, instead of talking about other people in a negative way, will try to find positive ways to talk about people and think about it from their perspective, maybe not just try to paint the situation in a bad light and then gossip about it. So that's humility and communication. And also, second point, humility and teachability. And maybe there's a better word for this, but it's kind of the word that stood out to me, is this idea of teachability, of being somebody that's teachable. How we respond to our own limitations and growth is another key aspect of if we're humble or not. Proverbs 11:2 says, "When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom." And that's very true. Teachability means that we will be able to admit mistakes, number one, and that's not easy to do. When we make a mistake, one of our first impulse is probably to either try to cover it up or hope people didn't notice, whatever it is. When we fall, take a spill or something like that, usually our first instinct, if it's not too bad, is to quickly jump up and look around and hope that nobody saw it, just because that's our instinct. We don't want people to see that we tripped and fell, even though everybody does that. It's not like it's any personal shortcoming of us, but we jump up and we look around and we hope nobody saw it. When I make a mistake, what am I willing to acknowledge that I was wrong? I think that really shows whether we're humble or not, or whether we always try to minimize our errors and try to divert from them and make sure people don't notice. And then being willing to ask for help is another aspect of this, where if we're humble, we'll be willing, if we don't understand something, if we're not sure about something, we don't just try to act like we do understand it or move ahead without asking for help. We're willing to ask for help. We're humble enough that it doesn't matter. I can admit that I'm weak and that I don't understand and ask for help about it. It shows a kind of a vulnerability and this willingness, being teachable, willingness to learn from others. And then accept constructive criticism is another aspect of this that it's hard to do. When somebody comes to us with constructive criticism, again, one of our first impulses is usually to say, well, find something in their life that they're failing in and point that out to them. That's hopefully not what we do, but often that's kind of our first impulse, is to say, well, you have some things to work on yourself. But we have to be open to feedback and use that as an opportunity to grow and not become defensive. And a humble person can do that. They can say, I know I'm not perfect, and I appreciate the feedback that you're giving me, and we can grow from that. That constructive criticism can actually be very helpful if it's brought in the right spirit. And if we're willing to hear it, it's something that can actually help us a lot in growing. And sometimes we're probably not willing or open enough with each other in helping each other see there's errors in our lives and pointing them out so that somebody else can grow from knowing that. And thirdly, humility and honor. How we recognize and treat others is another action here. Romans 12:10 says, "Be kindly affectionate one to another with brotherly love, in honor preferring one another." And I think that's the third thing here. We added communication, teachability, and honor, where this is the idea of giving credit to other people. I don't need all the credit for myself. I can give it to other people and recognize what they did, and that's a very valuable part of honoring other people. We'll also be thankful. That's practicing gratitude and honoring other people. I think that's just really what it comes down to, is showing respect to people in authority, to those who have helped us, and acknowledging their role and saying, you're a person that has helped me in my life, and be willing to say that and point that out to other people. So humility and honor, humility and teachability, and humility and communication. I think if we look at those aspects and we think about how we react when those come up in our everyday life, we begin to get an idea where I am in the aspect of humility. In closing, humility is the path to rest. Jesus was very humble. He was a humble person, and he promised that, he says, and these verses say it as well here in Colossians, they close by saying, "And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also ye are called in one body, and be ye thankful." And that's the end result of humility, is a feeling of peace, of rest, that, again, I don't need to be acknowledged for everything I do. I don't need to be angry at everything that's inconvenient that happens to me. I can be at peace and at rest with whatever happens, knowing that God is my Savior, and no matter what happens, I can rest in that. Jesus said that his yoke is easy and his burden is light, and understanding that, I think, is just a big part in, if we're practicing what Jesus was, a humble person, and internalizing that and living that out, that's who we will be as well. There'll be an inner peace, and I think people will be drawn to that. They'll see that, and they'll be drawn to it, and they'll see that in our lives and how we live and how we react to things, and it'll be a drawing that other people will see in our lives. So in closing, Jesus practiced yielding to the point of the cross. Can we follow his example? And I think that's what it comes down to, is that Jesus yielded his whole life for us. He submitted to the will of God, and he yielded to the point of the cross. And can we, in the little things of life, be willing to do that and practice humility in the way that we live? This time, why don't we kneel for a word of prayer?